Hey, welcome back to Kiss and Tell Magazine podcast. Happy 2025, almost under 1 year. But welcome back, and we're here today with Keeley Rankin. I hope I said that right. She's our guest today. Welcome, Keeley.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, well, welcome. We're very happy to have you here because you're going to talk about something that people don't talk about enough, which is touchless leads to sexless.
Right.
So can you explain that for our viewers?
Yeah, so often, so I work as a sex and relationship coach, have for the last 15 years. And a lot of times when people come to me and say, like, "Look, I'm not having enough sex in my relationship," or couples come in and say, like, we're not having enough sex, we want things to feel different, we want intimacy to flow better. I always ask about touch. I'm like, how much are you guys touching? And what's
Right.
almost always true is couples that are sexless are also touchless.
Mhm.
And so my whole thing with couples that I say to them is like, let's bring touch back online before we try and get the sex back online. Because oftentimes the bodies need to get reacquainted and used to that physical contact and being able to understand the difference in the touches between like, this is comforting touch or reassuring touch versus this is sensual touch. This is seduction, desire touch. Because these are all very different places for the body to understand touch from.
So when you say that to couples, are they surprised?
It depends. I'd say half of them are surprised. And interestingly enough, I'd say in couples themselves, when I have that conversation, normally one person is like, yeah, that would be great. I would love just more touch in general. And
Mhm.
the other person is like, let's just get to the sex part, or we don't need more touch. People have a very interesting relationship with touch in general. It's very unique for each individual, how they feel about touch, different types of touch, ways they like to be touched. So it
What
can
do you
open up
mean?
also. It, in my experience, it has a lot to do with what was happening as a young child, how
Okay.
people were touching you or not touching you. A story I'm thinking of right now is I worked with a woman for a while, and her mother would always touch her hair, like constantly, like grabbing and touching her hair, and it just drove her nuts. But she felt like she had to stay and receive that touch because her mother was her interpretation was like it was a self-soothing technique for her mother. And so
Mhm.
her relationship with touch was that I have to let people touch my body even when I don't want it. And it was a long process for her to understand what is pleasurable touch. How do I know when I'm done? How do I let my partner know when I'm done? Because she was so used to overriding her own boundaries because of her childhood experience.
Mhm.
And many people have lots of stories similar to that when they start to look at like what happened around touch when I was a kid.
Right.
Wanted touch, unwanted touch. How did I ask for it? How did I let people know I was done? Um, what was being offered? All of those different pieces.
So basically, when you're doing the session, are you like giving them examples? Are you giving them homework? What do you mean?
Oh, and actually how to bring touch back?
Like,
Yes, tons and tons and tons of information, homework, things in
uh,
session for sure. I
okay.
often find just giving people like theory or hey, you should touch more is most often is not enough. If
Mhm.
they wouldn't be in my office, honestly, if it was enough, because they would just hear someone say, like, bring touch back in, and they would do that and it would be fine. um, touch can be really loaded too. In couples that struggle around intimacy and frequency and pleasure, there can also be this feeling of like, well, one person only touches as an initiation to move towards sex. And so being able to bring the touch back in, that doesn't mean this is leading towards something more or leading towards a sexual connection is oftentimes like the first place to start of like we're just talking about touch as like making physical contact entering into people's physical spaces without expectation. Oftentimes that expectation that comes in touch can ruin energy in all of the erotic space. So teaching somebody how to come into touch with desire with no expectations is a skill that most people need to learn that they don't have because no one teaches or talks about touch that way.
Right.
But being able to really show up with like, I want you, I'm bringing a touch that says I want you, but I have no expectations here is one of the best touches to bring eroticism about. But
Mhm.
we have to start with just like, how do we touch bodies in general and
Mhm.
learning each other's bodies, learning ways that we like to touch. So trying all the different ways of touching on, and then also learning how to read our partner's cues and letting our partner, we're just talking specifically about people who are coupled at this time, but learning how our partner enjoys being touched and being able to communicate with those two things. And
Mhm.
interestingly enough, it reminds me of, I think what, I think I'm not surprised by it anymore, but I was very surprised by this when I realized that a lot of times it's not that when people don't communicate about pleasure, like it's oftentimes that they just don't know what they want. And so sometimes there'll be this like, oh, well, I'm touching my partner and I'm not getting any response, and she doesn't respond or he doesn't respond, and I don't know how to get them excited. And more often than not, when I turn to that partner and I say, like, what's going on? They're like, I have no idea. Like, I actually don't know what I want. I don't know what feels good. Like, it
Right.
all feels good or all feels neutral, or I'm not really sure. And so I talk about that a lot in educating people, because I think sometimes there's this like, oh, my partner's withholding from me, when
Mhm.
in fact their partner just doesn't have the awareness or the skills or an understanding of their own body enough to give feedback.
Right. I mean, that's not something that they teach you in sex ed.
No, we don't. We don't teach about touching or
Right.
receiving, or yeah, the giving and receiving part of pleasure. Right.
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 And
Unfor yeah,
yeah.
unfortunately.
I mean, well, do you find it's a bigger topic than even what we're discussing? I mean, we're addressing it in the moment here between us, but even in your sessions, don't you think it takes, what, at least 10 sessions to make a difference? I would think. Maybe
I
more.
mean, it depends. Some people can pick up on. So when I think about touching,
Mm-hmm.
I often go into these two places of like giving and receiving.
Mm-hmm.
And giving is actually much easier to teach for most people, like how to give a touch that feels pleasurable for them. Receiving is much, much, much more difficult. Like receiving is an act of non-doing, giving is an act of doing. And
Mm-hmm.
so I often some people can just do nothing and take in touch and receive without feeling guilty or worried or what's going to happen next, or getting lost in like a laundry list of things, or I don't deserve this. And some people are great. They're just like, I'm fine. I'm present. I can be here and receive touch and give feedback and let my body move into a pleasurable space or a comfortable space or a safe space. Other people, that's years and years and years of work to learn how to let go of the defenses and feel safe to let down. So, in general, giving is much easier to teach. I don't know that I'd put like a amount of sessions on it, but the receiving can be actually one of the more difficult parts.
Right. So receiving, allowing it to happen, and
Yeah,
not just allowing, but being present. So when the touch was happening, they actually feel it, and making the mind-body connection.
absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, it's like, how do we actually stay present in the
Right.
experience of someone touching our bodies and not run off into a million different corners in our brain that we can go to?
But yeah, hide in some manner,
Yeah.
which is interesting. Do you find this happens more in a long-term relationship, or even somebody that's only been together 6 months to a year?
That's an interesting question. You know, I'm not sure that I have a great answer to that around like the time frame. I think it's more sort of, in the honeymoon phase, people
Mhm.
tend to, which is for people who don't know, the honeymoon phase is sort of like this time in which you first meet someone and you're really excited about them, and you're oftentimes lost a lot in the fantasy of who they are because you don't quite know who they are. And there's a lot of erotic excitement there, and there's a lot of desire to be close. And so touch happens, easily and frequently, and people are pretty open in those spaces to touch as well as
Mhm.
gestures of physical intimacy. Um, and as soon as that honeymoon period wears off, I would say if someone has a historical family triggers around touch, it normally shows up. There is people that I've worked with, it's hard to say what was happening in people's couples before they come in too, because I think sometimes people hit the honeymoon phase and they're like, wow, things we need support. They're comfortable with therapy. They're comfortable with coaching. They've done it on their own or another couple's work and they jump right into it and we can kind of like figure things out early on. But for other people, they go many, many, many years. And so, yeah, it's kind of hard to say exactly like what was really going on before they actually showed up. So
Right. And
I
what
will
they
say, oh, go ahead.
go ahead. Oh, go
Well, I was
ahead.
going to say one thing that I have noticed though is the touchless really comes a lot of times either from touch not feeling good in one direction or the other. Like the person who's offering touch feels like their partner doesn't like receiving it, or the person being touched doesn't like the touch. And there can often be this second part where it feels like the touch is only offered in a bid for intimacy. So a lot of the couples that I'll work with, it's like, oh, my partner only reaches out when they actually just want me to have sex with them
Right.
versus they reach out for comfort or they reach out for connection. And so
Mhm.
that is like one of the main pieces that I really try and get back into and help bring into that couple where touch gets to happen, that exchange gets to happen without that pressure of it's, feeling like it's got to go somewhere or it's going to go somewhere.
Right. So, you teach them that just focusing on what is happening in that moment,
Right.
versus what it may lead to or not.
Yeah, I mean, for some people, I'll just say, like, you're not having sex for a
Mhm.
week till I see you next. Like, you're going to
Right.
do this touch thing, and I'm taking it off the table because their partner has gotten so cold and resistant to those attempts for closeness. And their body feels so much pressure that, like, if I let this person in my space, they're going to try and get me naked and have sex with me.
Mhm.
So sometimes I'll even say to certain couples, like, we're just going to take it off the table just for a week. Let's just try it. Let's see how it is. So we can let that person that's feeling more anxious about what touch means sort of like take a deep breath and start to figure out, like, is there touch that they actually enjoy? And I'll normally say to couples, like, try for 3 touches a day,
Mhm.
3 mindful, connected to your own body, with no intention other than just to connect, like reaching out touches during the day, 3 different times, and see how it feels in a week, which is often really interesting to have them report back on.
What do you have to educate on and teach different types of touching? Is that what is happening? Do you have to
Yeah,
like define it for them, or what do you do exactly?
it sort of depends. I think it depends on where the couple is and how much ease there is and how comfortable people feel with touching. So normally we'll go all the way back into histories of touch, or ways in which they've been touched romantically, how much touch happens with friends and family now, because that's also a really interesting thing. Like for some adults, their only physical touch is with their romantic partner at the time.
Mhm.
And that's also a really interesting thing, that, especially after COVID, like people aren't hugging anymore. They're barely even doing handshakes. The only time they might sit close is if they're piling into a car and there's like, got to sit 4 in a 3-seater. So they might be hip to hip, you
Mhm.
know? So looking at just touch in general, like how are we letting our bodies explore and be touched, and where does safety come up, and how do we feel about all of those things is a really important part. And then how do we offer touch? Uh, what's really nice that in the way that I work, and specifically if I have 2 people in the room that are in a relationship, is I'll actually have them touch each other in front of me. Like, okay, you're going to offer a comforting touch right now to your partner. So I'm going to have you look at your partner, make eye contact, and just reach out and touch like you would if you were offering a comforting touch. Like your partner's got home from work, it's been a rough day. How would you reach out and offer support? and I'll watch what happens. How does this person, I guess the word would be perform that task,
Right.
and see kind of like what was my experience of watching this exchange, and how did their partner receive that touch. And it tells me a lot about that first place of comfort, which is oftentimes the place where touch becomes the most important when couples become sexless. Is like we want to go back to, can touch be supportive and safe and a place for restfulness? And then once I can assess what's happening there, then I sort of decide which directions we need to go in terms of education and skill set and building and all of those different pieces. And so every couple is really, really, really different, but assessing for how comfortable does that exchange happen of physical contact when someone needs extra support is a big part of assessing that.
But they're surprised to learn that when they're touchless, it leads to less sex. But they're surprised to learn that that was one of the steps that led them to not connecting intimately.
I would say people are often like, yeah, duh, more so. Like they're like, when I mention it or when I start to pry around kind of like what's happening, they're like, yeah, like, okay, that makes sense. Because I think a lot of times couples think back on what was the beginning of their relationship like, where they were having, for most part, the most amount of intimacy and feeling the most connected in that space of desire and lust. And so I think most couples are like, oh, yeah, like, wow, that used to happen in the morning across coffee or in the exchange leaving the house or sitting next to each other on the couch. We'd get like cozy, cozy, you know. So there's oftentimes for most people sort of a, aha, yeah, that totally makes sense. Like, yeah, we need to work on touch. And
You,
interestingly enough, very few people fight me on it. Most people are like, yeah, that I would like that. Both people like are like, yeah, I would genuinely like more touch in the couple. So it's very rare that someone says they don't.
yeah, do you find, what about, do you say anything about individual touch? About, I mean, I'm not just talking about masturbation, but just the individual touching their own body in
Mm.
general. You know, do
It's
they
actually one of the main ways that I teach people about how to touch another person's body is I have tons and tons. So the way that I work with people is very experiential. It's in games and exercises and trying new things on. I often talk about it as like you're in my office and my intention is to stretch you, like to stretch you, get you out of your comfort zone, try on some new things, really actually learn skills, so, as well as processing historical pieces or ways in which we might be stuck psychologically or emotionally, it's really, really learning new ways of being in our own body's energy and our own eroticism, as well as sharing that with another person. And so, oftentimes, if I'm working with someone where it feels like there's a lot of disconnection around how they're reaching out and touching their partner, we'll pause all of that and just go into self-touch and learning about like what does it feel like to have touch. And we'll start with just like touches on hands, like can you just touch your own hand in a way that feels good, in a way that feels pleasurable, and really connect with that and have a curiosity and an interest in your own touching on your own body. That is the first place by far that people need to start before they can then take that curiosity and interest in touching to another person.
are you surprised at some of the reactions that, why would I touch myself? You know, they might,
Yeah, it
yeah,
depends. I'm pretty good at this point of surprising people into doing things that they might not normally want to do.
yeah.
um, every once in a while, though, it hasn't happened in many, many years. But yeah, there can be people who feel like, what's the point of this? It's what's really great oftentimes though in couples work is I wouldn't just have like one person do it.
Mhm.
Even if I sort of assess and it feels like, oh, you know what, this person just, you know, there really is no judgment. I mean, because there's no place for us to get this training
Right.
unless you happen to have a lover who had the skills themselves, were good teachers, and
Mhm.
could really talk to you about this stuff. It's so rare
Mhm.
that anybody really has these skills, honestly, because we just don't teach them.
Right.
And, most people's hands are on these days, specifically like all these gadgets, remote controls in our phones, and all of these things that really don't have that sentient being experience of like, oh, this is what it feels like to put my hands on a living, breathing thing that has consciousness and can respond to touch. And
Right.
so I, it, it's great to be able to do that with two people because sometimes there'll be an inspiration from their partner that is, I know in some ways, like just playing along. But
Mhm.
that inspiration of their partner saying, like, wow, I realize like it feels so good if I use like the back of my hand along this area of my hand. And I didn't realize that had a lot of pleasure and sensation. And it kind of moved into my finger. It can inspire that other person that felt a little like silly. The people who have like more resistance or tend to be a little bit less open to playing along, it often has to do with feeling like they either don't want to fail, like there's a deep-seated fear, like if I get this wrong, I'm going to fail, my partner might leave. Because
Yeah.
there's real risks oftentimes by the time people show up in my office, like the relationship is on the rocks and one person's pretty, maybe one foot out the door.
Right.
Um, so there's this deep fear of like not wanting to get it wrong. And there can also be this like, it's not okay to be playful, which
Mhm.
is a really interesting one when we think about it with sex, because we have to have an aspect of play to have great, fun, long term sex. And when people start to hit this, like, oh, I'm going to try a new thing, but I can't be playful and it's not okay for me to be playful, that ends up being a really interesting thread that I'm oftentimes trying to pull out. Like, it's okay to be playful. It's okay to
Mhm.
get it wrong. It's okay to take risks. It's okay. It's okay to laugh. Like, it doesn't
Right.
always have to be this serious, get everything perfect,
Right.
romantic drama.
Right.
Um, it's just not realistic in the bedroom for any long-term satisfaction, in my experience at least.
Are people surprised by the comment playful? Do they
Um,
misconstrue it?
I would say most people are relieved because I think sometimes there's this serious quality of sex, like it's
Yeah.
got to be this passion, clothes ripping off, your body never makes a funny noise. I think back to the very first blog post I ever wrote, and it was called Embracing the Awkward Up and Down Moments of Sex. Because I think on some level, we all want the person that we're expressing our desires to and our vulnerabilities to and our bodies to in this open and naked way. We want them to be attracted to us. We want them to think that we're sexy and we know what we're doing and we're bringing pleasure. But I think sometimes that can come at the expense of like the spaciousness that needs to be there for these deep, expansive pleasure states that are possible, and I believe for everybody. But
Mhm.
that closing in of it has to look this very specific way. I have to do this very specific thing. I have to make these very specific sounds. My body has to respond in this very specific way, really limits the capacity of people to find pleasure. It's like it really is in that opening up and that letting go and that spaciousness. And we talked a little bit earlier about that touch without expecting anything.
Mhm.
That is the spaciousness that allows for pleasure and that leads to couples wanting to be close intimately for many, many, many years because it's not just one good experience. Like that's not going to sustain a couple.
Mhm.
One great sexual experience isn't just going to sustain a couple for the rest of their lives. It's these ongoing experiences.
Yeah.
And that playfulness has to be woven in there or the opportunities of what can happen just get smaller and smaller.
Right. Do you ever talk about how society isn't a part of the bedroom?
How it is a part of the bedroom.
Yeah, it is, but we allow it to be in there, but it shouldn't
Yeah.
be in there.
Yeah.
It's only about the two people.
Yeah, that webs in, I think, a lot too with shame. How we, I see society as either preconceived ideas, like a just miseducation, or, we see this, there's a lot of that in porn, right? Porn looks this very specific ways. Most people are viewing a very specific type of porn. And so there's all these ideas about what sex can be.
Mhm.
Um, and also the way shame sort of like filters in and takes away that playfulness. It's very, very difficult to be in a shame spiral or in your shame and
Mhm.
be playful. And that is oftentimes a product of society and, what either what we inherited from our parents, or what our parents inherited from society, or what was put upon us. So
Do
yeah,
you
some clients will go there with me. Some clients will want to talk about that, and
mhm.
they'll be really open to it and really curious about it. Um, other people not so much. So I sort of follow people where they want to go,
But
essentially, where they're interested.
do you think that touch thing is connected to that as well? The
To
shame,
the shame.
the
Yes.
yeah, uh-huh,
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, what's really interesting is sometimes I'll work with a couple. I'm always a little surprised at this because it's not something I think in our culture we think too much about. It's much more in the Latin culture, um, that I hear this asked for. But the idea of PDA. So sometimes I'll have someone, when we start to talk about touch, they'll say like, "Yeah, I really want my partner to touch me more in public. Like I want to have this PDA, like this." Like they're reaching for my hand, they're kissing me, they're putting their arm around me, like we're being flirty out in public.
Right.
Um, and yeah, it's interesting the way that that gets held in different cultures as well, and in different family systems, and how people grew up, and what's okay to show and what's not okay to show.
Mhm.
So those are always really interesting conversations to navigate, because for some people, they're very, very uncomfortable with any displays of touch in public. Like they're deeply, deeply, deeply uncomfortable with that. And it's challenging when they're partnered with someone that's like, that feels really important to me. Like, how do we cross the bridge in that? Um, so it's a unique struggle, but yeah, a fun challenge to explore, I think.
You have people once they get to like they've met what they came in for, you help them learn this. Do you find that they come back struggling with it? Or do you
Do they come back strongly with?
struggling with the same issue? Or does it, once they understand it, are they easily able to implement it?
I would say more often than not, the presenting issue which people show up with quickly sort of gets, in some regard, like left in the dust in general. Like most people who show up with their concern, um, quickly see that there's a lot of other things happening in the couple, a lot of other places where pleasure could be. I mean, if we're going to spin it positively, like a lot of other places where pleasure could be an option that they just didn't know was possible.
Mhm.
Um, so I think it sort of depends. I think in general in our society, I think we limit, I talked a little bit on this before about like what's possible, but we limit and put ourselves into this vacuum of like, this is what's sex is, this is what's available for me.
Mhm.
And I think when people get a taste of, oh, there's this whole huge, spacious, pleasurable world that I could be engaging in, enjoying in, sharing with someone. I think it's
Mhm.
often very, very exciting. And there's a natural hunger and curiosity to want to explore more and into different territories and different areas. Um,
So they
Sometimes
would,
people show up and they've got like one thing, we work on that, and they're done.
but
But a lot of times people are like, I had no idea, like why, I
yeah,
can't think of, I mean, there's so many people who say to me, they're like, why did I not know this earlier? Why
right.
did I not know this? Why didn't I not know this in my 20s? Like, why did I have to wait to my 50s to
Right.
figure these things out about my own body, about other people's bodies, about like what the right connections are, about how to approach people in a
Mhm.
confident way, all of these different components that we no one talks about in any um, nuanced or eloquent, educated way. So
But
yeah,
if they do, sometimes I think it is one conversation and that's it, but it's
right,
a continuous conversation, so it's not, I mean, as you know, in the sessions, but in general, you know, when you're talking about anything about touch or what your needs are or wants, it doesn't stop there.
right,
Just because you had the conversation and you both learn something new to implement doesn't
right.
mean you can stop talking about it now.
Mhm.
You should talk about it again, and it might change in a month or a year or whatever, And plus, in my opinion, that when you mention that people say, "Oh my God, I didn't realize all this options was out there," and continuing that aha freedom moment sexually, that helps you continue the conversation
Right.
so that
Yeah.
it remains, oh, this is fun, this is
Mhm.
playful, this can be more than, just the missionary position, you
Right.
know, so, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Right. And I often think about that as like helping people break free of the idea that everything has to be perfect. Like the
Mhm.
playfulness plays into that, but it's also like it's okay to make mistakes or be
Mhm.
awkward or try something that doesn't work. And I
Right.
think giving people the confidence to feel like to try things on and laugh about it if it doesn't work. It's okay. And it's also okay if it takes like a couple times. I normally say like try it 3 times
Mhm.
because the first time is like you're just trying to figure some things out. The second time you're like assessing more. The third time you got a pretty good sense like how these things could go.
Right.
And after 3 times you're like, no, I don't like that. I really not my thing. Like set it down for a little while. And you touched on something really important too, which is how things are always changing, truly, consciously, psychologically, emotionally, and also physically in our body. As we age, as we go through different things in our life, we actually want different types of touch. And
Mhm.
if we get stuck on this idea of like, well, you liked this touch when we met, or you liked this touch last year, or this is what used to work for you, why doesn't it work for you now? Versus every time we reach out to touch our partner, we're exploring and being open and curious about what is the touch that feels good today.
Right.
Then we can ride those waves of change with each other and keep the curiosity, keep the openness, and keep the newness versus this is the one rote thing I do over and over and over again. And
Right.
so when I think in general of like what I'm trying to teach couples about physical intimacy, about sharing space and being in connection, I'm always holding that like, how do I help people really truly let go of it's this A, B, C, D thing to touch versus it's a state of showing up in yourself and in the couple that leads to that curious, playful, courageous, it's okay to try something and it not work
Mhm.
energy. Because otherwise you just end up stuck and you would end up back in my office, in a couple of years because you would be in the same but different scenario.
Right. Thank you for talking about the touchless leads to sexless, and
Yeah.
many other things today. You can find Keeley at her website, keeleyrankin.com. And also we're going to invite Keeley to come back for other topics too. So look forward to that. And we're going to end today with mentioning that Kiss and Tell is doing something new this year, which they call Do KNG. And you can send us questions, and in our newsletter, we'll answer as many questions as we can. That comes out twice a month. So, like this newsletter that just happened this week was one of the questions was, "Am I normal?" And we answered that. Is there a G spot? And we answer that. And these questions are from subscribers. So if you have a question, just email to K and not Ann, but N T at kissedandtellmagazine.com. Um, so thank you, Keeley, for today. It was nice talking to you.
Yeah, it was so much fun. Thank you so, so much for having me on, and I look forward to coming back.
Thank you.